The high desert comes at you sideways in late October, the wind carrying grit and juniper smoke in equal measure, the sky a bruised copper that makes everything look older than it is. Garrett Lund had been riding into that same sky for 31 years, and he still had not learned to look away from it. He was 53 and built the way men get built when they have spent 3 decades hauling iron and sleeping on the ground when circumstances required it, which was more often than he would have admitted to anyone who hadn't already figured it out. His beard was the color of a used railroad tie, gray and brown and something darker in between, and his hands on the grips of his motorcycle were the hands of a man who had repaired more things than he had ever broken, though the breaking was in the record too. He was the president of the Ash Creek Riders, the last founding member still in the cut, and he was coming down off the mesa on State Route 89 when he saw the girl. She was standing at the turnout above Saddle Rock, the gravel pullout where the truckers used to stop before the bypass went through, and she was not moving. That was the first thing that was wrong. The second was that she was alone. The third was that she was holding something against her chest with both arms wrapped around it the way a person holds something fragile, or irreplaceable, or both. Garrett did not decide to stop. His hands made the decision before his mind finished the question, and the motorcycle rolled to the shoulder in a scatter of loose rock and the engine knocked twice and went quiet. He sat for a moment, not dismounting, just reading the scene the way he had been reading scenes since he was young enough to understand that what a thing looked like and what a thing was were almost never the same. She was small, maybe 7, maybe 8, in a jacket 2 sizes too large, the sleeves pushed up past her wrists. Her boots were worn at the heel but tied correctly, double knotted, the way a particular kind of careful adult teaches a child. Her hair had been braided sometime earlier in the day and was coming loose on one side. She watched him get off the bike the way a child watches something big move when they are not sure yet whether to run. Garrett pulled off his helmet and set it on the seat. He did not walk toward her. He stood where he was, at the edge of the gravel, and let her decide what the distance would be. 47 seconds passed. He counted. Then she said, "You can't park there." He said, "I know." She looked at the motorcycle, then back at him. What she was holding, he could see now, was a plastic bag, the zipper seal kind, and inside the bag was a folded piece of paper. She held it like it cost something. The wind came across the mesa and she turned her shoulder into it without letting go of the bag. And something in that small mechanical instinct, that reflex of protection, made the air go out of Garrett Lund in a way it had not in a long time. The girl said her name was Cora. She did not offer a last name. Garrett did not ask for one. She said she was 8, and she offered this information the way children offer facts they believe to be useful rather than facts that have been asked for, and Garrett accepted it in the same spirit. He crouched down to her level, his knees popping in the wind, and rested his forearms on his thighs, and looked at the bag she was holding. He did not reach for it. He asked her how long she had been standing at the turnout, and she said since the bus. He asked which bus, and she pointed south, back toward Ash Creek proper, and said the school bus, which let her off at the corner, but she had not gone home because she needed to wait for someone who could knock. He said, "Who are you waiting for?" She thought about this. Not the way a child thinks when they are making something up, but the way a child thinks when they are deciding how much of the true thing to say. Then she said, "I don't know yet, but you stopped." A white sedan slowed on the highway and the woman driving it craned her neck to look at them, a man in a cut and a small girl at the edge of the road, and the sedan did not stop but it slowed almost to walking speed before it picked up again. Garrett had seen that slow before. He knew what the woman was calculating. He could not hold it against her. He turned back to Cora and said, "What's in the bag?" She said, "Something I wrote." He said, "Wrote to who?" She said, "I don't know his name, but he'll hear it if someone reads it where it can get to him." This was not an explanation that made sense. and Garrett did not pretend it was. He said, "Where do you need it red?" She told him. He stood up slowly, and the wind pulled at his vest and the three-patch on his back, the Ash Creek Rider's top rocker, bottom rocker, and the centerpiece with its sunburst and its jagged mountain line, caught the last of the copper light and held it. He said, "I'll take you home first." She said, "She doesn't know I didn't come home." He said, "That's why I'll take you first." There was a pause. She looked at the motorcycle. She said, "I've never been on one." He said, "I know." He walked back to the bike and opened the saddlebag on the left side and found the spare helmet, the small one he kept because one of his members, a man named Deke Karras, had a daughter who sometimes came to club events, and Garrett had learned 3 years ago to be prepared. He brought the helmet back and held it out to her, and she studied it for a moment and then shifted the bag to one arm and took the helmet with her free hand and did not let go of the bag, not once, while she put it on. They rode south into Ash Creek with the sun going down behind them and the mesa turning the color of dried blood above the dark line of the highway, and Garrett kept the speed at 40 and watched the road and did not ask her anything more. The address she gave him was on Sutton Street, a line of low houses set back from the road behind chain link and drought-killed grass, and the third house had a light on in the front window and a woman standing on the porch before they had even stopped, because the sound of the motorcycle in that quiet street was the kind of sound that carries. She was Cora's mother. Her name, Garrett would learn in the next 3 minutes, was Bev Molina. She was somewhere in her late 30s and wore the expression of a woman who had been managing fear for long enough that it had become part of her resting face, the eyes always slightly too open, the hands always slightly too ready. She came down the porch steps and Garrett held up one hand, palm out, the oldest and most universal signal, and she stopped at the foot of the steps and watched him help Cora off the bike and lift the helmet free. Cora handed the bag back and said, "He's okay, Mom." Bev looked at Garrett the way the woman in the sedan had looked, and then she looked at her daughter, and then something shifted behind her eyes. She said, "Come inside." Garrett said, "I'll stay here." She said, "I wasn't asking you." He came inside. The house was small and clean in the way that comes from effort rather than from ease, every surface bearing the marks of someone who worked to keep things decent, when decent cost more than it should. There was a child's drawing on the refrigerator, a motorcycle rendered in thick crayon strokes, purple and orange. Garrett noticed it and said nothing. Bev put a glass of water in front of him at the kitchen table and sat across from him with Cora between them, and Cora set the bag on the table. Bev said, "She's been talking about that thing for 3 weeks." Garrett looked at Cora. Cora looked at the bag. She said, "It has to be read somewhere that matters." Garrett said, "Tell me where." She named a place he knew. He had known it would be somewhere he knew. That was the part of it that made his hands go still on the table. The place was the County Veterans and Families Services building on Apache Street, 2 blocks west of the Ash Creek Civic Center, a low tan building with a parking lot full of cracks and a waiting room that smelled of floor wax and old coffee, and the particular stillness of places where people have waited a long time for things that did not always come. Garrett had been inside that building twice in his life, once at 29 when he went with a man named Phil Duda, his road captain back then, because Phil could not face the paperwork alone, and once at 41 for a reason he did not think about in daylight if he could help it. Bev Molina watched his face when Cora said the name of the building, and she said, "You know it." It was not a question. He said, "I know it." Bev folded her hands on the table. She said, "Her father has an appointment there on Friday morning. Court-ordered evaluation. Dependency review." She said the words the way people say words they have learned to say clinically, because saying them any other way takes too much out of you. If he doesn't appear, they default the review in his favor, and the temporary order stays. Garrett looked at Cora. Cora was looking at the bag. He said, "And the note?" Bev said, "She wants it read at the hearing." He said, "Who's reading it?" Bev said, "She is. She asked to address the hearing officer. I filed the request last week and they said a child's statement is permitted under Arizona Family Court procedure, but they have to waive the age requirement, and the hearing officer hasn't ruled on the waiver yet." She looked tired in a way that Garrett recognized as a tiredness that came from doing things correctly in a system that made doing things correctly into its own kind of obstacle. He said, "What's in the note?" Bev said, "I haven't read it." He looked at Cora. Cora said, "It's for the hearing officer." He said, "You wrote it yourself?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Does it say what you need said?" She thought about this with the same seriousness she had applied to every question he'd asked her. Then she said, "I think it needs to be heard by more than one person." Garrett looked at the bag on the table for a long moment. The plastic was fogged a little from her warmth, from the time she had spent holding it. He said, "Where's your dad right now?" Bev said, "He's at the house on Miller Road. He knows about Friday." Garrett said, "What does he know about it?" She said, "That if the review goes his way, the current arrangement continues." The current arrangement. Garrett did not ask her to translate. The translation was in the drawn-in way she held herself when she mentioned it, the slight retraction of her shoulders, the way Cora had moved slightly closer to her mother the moment the words Miller Road were spoken. He pushed back from the table and stood. He said, "I need to make a call." Bev said, "We're not your problem." He said, "I know." She said, "I mean it." He said, "I know you mean it." He went to the front door and stepped out onto the porch and took out his phone. The sky was full dark now, the mesa invisible against it, and the only light on Sutton Street was the amber cone of the streetlight at the corner and the yellow rectangle of the Molinas' front window. He found the number and pressed call and waited 2 rings. The voice that answered was gravel and smoke, the voice of a man named Deke Karras, who was the Ash Creek Riders' sergeant-at-arms and had held that position for 9 years and earned it a dozen times over in the way that only comes from actually being tested. Garrett said, "I need eyes on an address." He gave it. Deke said nothing for a moment and then said, "Tonight?" Garrett said, "Tonight." Then he went back inside. The Ash Creek Riders had 63 full-patch members at that time, which was the number Garrett gave when Deke asked him how wide to open it the next morning. Not selective, not the inner ring, all 63. They met at the chapter's regular location, a corrugated steel building at the edge of an industrial lot off Mesquite Road that had once been a welding shop and now bore 40 years of the club's accumulated presence in every surface, the walls hung with photographs and maps and names, and the particular sediment of an organization that had existed long enough to have its own gravity. The meeting started at 7 in the morning, which was not a regular hour, and every man who received the call the night before was there when Garrett walked in, their bikes parked in the lot, in the long irregular line that, from above, must have looked like a sentence written in an alphabet only they read. Garrett did not waste their time with preamble. He had never been a man who used 5 words when one would do. He stood at the front of the room and told them what he knew. A girl named Cora, 8 years old, had been waiting at the Saddle Rock turnout alone because she needed someone to carry something she had written to a place where it would matter. He told them about the hearing on Friday. He told them about the building on Apache Street and what it meant in the context of Arizona dependency review procedure, which several of them knew better than he did because several of them had been through it, either themselves or alongside someone who had. He told them about the temporary order and what would happen if the review defaulted. He did not tell them about the drawing on the refrigerator, the purple and orange motorcycle in thick crayon. He did not need to. He said, "I'm going to be in that parking lot on Friday morning. Any man who wants to be there is welcome." There was a silence of approximately 4 seconds, which in a room of 63 men is not a silence at all, but a collective breath. then a man named Royce Farber, who had ridden with the Ash Creek Riders for 22 years and was not a man who moved quickly at anything, raised his hand and said, "What time?" Garrett said, "Hearing is at 9. I want to be there at 8. Another silence. Then a man in the back named Cobb Tilden, who was 26 and the newest patch in the room, said, "Do we need to wear our cuts?" Garrett looked at him. "Yes," he said. "We need to wear our cuts." The room did not erupt. It did not cheer. It simply, quietly, moved, the way a hillside moves when the water under it has finally decided where to go. Men took out their phones. The phone chain that left that building in the next 40 minutes reached beyond the 63, because 63 men each knew other men in the same world, and the word that went out was simple. Friday morning, Apache Street, 8 o'clock. Be there or not, but know what it is. Deke came to Garrett after the room had started to clear and said, "There's the matter of the hearing officer." Garrett said, "I know." Deke said, "A room full of us doesn't automatically mean she reads the note." Garrett said, "It means she's not alone when she tries." Deke looked at him for a moment with the evaluating expression he wore when he was deciding whether a plan was sound or whether it was something else, something fueled by something older. He said, "You got somebody on the procedural side," Garrett said, "working on it." He was. He had made a second call the night before, after he left Sutton Street, to a woman named Selma Tran, who was not a member of anything except the Arizona State Bar and a firm conviction that the family court system needed people willing to show up in it. Selma had been the attorney in Phil Duda's case 19 years before. She answered on the second ring, which told him she still had his number in her phone, which told him something about the kind of person she was. Selma Tran called Garrett back at noon on Thursday with 4 pieces of information. The first was that she had filed a supplemental notice of the child's intent to address the hearing, citing Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 25-403, subsection 5, which allows a court to consider a child's preferences and concerns in any proceeding affecting the child's welfare, regardless of age, provided the court finds sufficient maturity and a genuine statement of interest. The hearing officer was a man named Frank Bellard, and Bellard had a record on this particular provision of being cautious, which meant he tended to require more documentation before granting it than the statute strictly required, which was his right, and also, in Selma's professional view, a consistent misreading of the statute's intent. The second piece of information was that the father, a man named Arthur Molina, had legal representation, which complicated the matter because his attorney had filed a motion the previous afternoon to exclude third-party statements from the review, a motion that was technically aimed at a social services summary, but was worded broadly enough to potentially sweep in anything that was not direct testimony from a party with standing. The third was that Bev's own attorney, a young man named Derek Sheets, who was competent and overworked in the way that legal aid attorneys tend to be, had filed a response but had not yet addressed the Section 25-403 angle directly. The fourth was that Selma had spoken with Derek Sheets and was now co-counsel of record as of 9 that morning, which she said without inflection, as a fact, as something that had simply happened the way procedurally correct things happen. Garrett said, "What do we need from Cora?" Selma said, "A declaration of her own authorship of the document and a verbal statement of her intent to present it. She'd give it to me. I'd attach it to a supplemental motion by close of business today." There was a pause. Garrett said, "She's 8. Selma said, "I know how old she is." He said, "Is she going to understand what she's signing?" Selma said, "She's going to understand what she wrote. That's the part that matters." He drove to Sutton Street that afternoon. Bev let him in and said nothing about the previous 2 days and nothing about the fact that he had apparently acquired a lawyer on her behalf, which he interpreted as neither acceptance nor rejection, but as the exhaustion of a woman who had learned to receive help without commentary, because commentary cost energy she was not spending on anything optional. Cora was at the kitchen table doing homework, a worksheet of long division, and she looked up when Garrett came in and said, "Did you find someone?" He said, "I found someone." She said, "Did you tell them about the note?" He said, "I told them." "They want to hear it from you." She looked at the worksheet, then at him, then at the refrigerator where the purple and orange motorcycle drawing still hung, slightly crooked now, one corner of the tape coming free. She said, "I'll tell them." She told them. Selma drove to Sutton Street at 4 in the afternoon and sat at the kitchen table across from Cora, and Garrett sat in the chair nearest the door and did not participate, because his job at that moment was not to participate but to be present, which is a different job and one that requires more discipline. Cora explained, in the flat declarative sentences of a child who has rehearsed not the words but the truth behind the words, what the document was, and why she had written it, and what she needed it to do. She said, "It says what it's like when he comes to the house." She said, "It says that I know it's not supposed to be like that, because my teacher told us." She said, "It says I'm not scared to say it, but I need someone big to say it with me, because he doesn't listen when I'm the only one saying it." Selma wrote everything down in a careful hand and did not cry, which Garrett could see required something from her. Selma was good at her work. When she left, she had everything she needed. Garrett walked her to her car. She said, "She's extraordinary." He said, "She's 8. Selma looked at him for a moment. She said, "Garrett." She was standing alone on a highway shoulder holding a sealed bag because she needed someone big enough to be heard. She got in the car. He stood in the street after the car had gone, in the early dark, with the sound of Sutton Street around him, a dog somewhere, a television through a wall, the distant rumble of a semi on the bypass, and he did not think about Cora because he was not ready yet for the thing that thinking about Cora led him toward. He got on his bike and rode. He rode for 40 minutes without direction, which was the closest he came anymore to prayer. Friday arrived the way difficult days always arrived in the high desert, without ceremony, the sky going from black to gray to a flat, hard blue that promised nothing. The Apache Street parking lot of the Ash Creek Families and Veterans Services building had 14 marked spaces and a handicapped access ramp and a bike rack that had never in Garrett's recollection been used for a bike. And by 7:45 that morning the lot was full, and the street in front of it was full, and the side street to the north was full, and men were still arriving. He had said 63. The number that showed up was 91. He learned later that 28 of the additional riders had come from contacts made through the phone chain, men from neighboring clubs in the same broad world who had heard the call and made the drive, some of them as far as Flagstaff, and one man, a barrel-chested rider named Sonny Oates, who had ridden down from Prescott the night before and slept in his truck in a gas station lot off the highway so he wouldn't be late. 91 motorcycles on Apache Street at 8 in the morning made a statement without intending to, which is the most persuasive kind of statement. Garrett stood near the building entrance and watched them park, watched them file into the lot with the automatic courtesy of men who have ridden together long enough to understand space and order. And he felt something in his chest that was not pride, exactly because pride implies ownership of something you created. And he had not created any of these men, had not created their willingness to drive 100 miles on a Thursday night for a child none of them had met. What he felt was closer to what you feel when a calculation you were afraid to trust turns out to be right. A woman came out of the building at 8:05, a clerk in a county lanyard, and she looked at the lot and then at Garrett and said, "Is there a permit for this?" Garrett said, "We're here for the 9 o'clock hearing." Cora Molina's statement, the clerk said. "You can't all go inside," he said. "We're not all going inside." She looked at the lot again. 91 men in leather and denim and patches, standing by their bikes in the early morning cold, not loud, not moving, just present, the way a wall is present. She said, "What are you going to do?" Garrett said, "Stand here." She went back inside. At 8:20, a black sedan pulled into the far end of the lot, and from it stepped Arthur Molina, with a man in a suit who was clearly the attorney. Molina was mid-40s, squared off, wearing the expression of a man who had decided before leaving home that today was going to go his way. He walked the length of the lot. He saw the bikes. He saw the men. He slowed. He kept walking, because stopping would have meant admitting the bikes were something, and he had decided they were not going to be something. His attorney touched his elbow once and said something low, and Molina shook his head. They went inside. At 8:35, Bev's car came around the corner and parked at the curb, and Bev got out, and then Cora got out, and Cora had the bag. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at 91 men standing in the morning cold, and her face did something it had not done either time Garrett had seen her. It went loose, not afraid. The other thing, she pressed the bag against her chest, both arms around it, and turned to find Garrett in the crowd, and he was already there, 4 feet away, and she said, "How many?" He said, 91. She looked out at the lot. She said, "That's a lot of knocking." He said, "That's the idea." They went inside. The hearing room in the Apache Street building was a room designed to minimize drama, beige walls and fluorescent lights, and 2 tables, and a raised desk for the hearing officer. The kind of room whose neutrality is itself a kind of pressure, a reminder that what happens here is a procedure, classified and managed, not a human event. Frank Bellard was a man of about 60 in a gray suit, careful-faced, with the eyes of someone who had heard a great many things said in this room and had learned not to show what they did to him. He was already at his desk when Garrett and Bev and Cora came in with Selma Tran, and Arthur Molina and his attorney were already at the respondents' table, and a woman from the Department of Child Safety named Harris, who had a clipboard and a badge lanyard and the air of someone who had prepared thoroughly for this morning, sat to one side. Bellard looked at Selma, then at the supplemental filings in front of him, then at Cora, who had taken a seat beside her mother at the petitioner's table and set the bag in front of her on the table, with both hands flat on either side of it. Bellard said, "Ms. Tran, the supplemental notice." Selma said, "Yes, Your Honor. Pursuant to the Section 25-403 subsection 5 provision, and attaching the child's authorship declaration filed at close of business yesterday, we're requesting that Cora Molina be permitted to present her written statement directly to the hearing officer." Arthur Molina's attorney, a man named Carl Breck, said, "Your Honor, the motion to exclude third-party statements is still pending." Selma said, "The Section 25-403 provision doesn't constitute a third-party statement. The child is a direct interested party in any proceeding affecting her welfare." Bellard said, "I'm going to rule on the exclusion motion first." Breck said, "The motion stands on its face." Bellard looked at it. Bellard looked at Cora. He said, "How long is the statement?" Cora said, 1 page. Bellard said, "Did you write it yourself?" She said, "Yes." He said, "When?" She said, "Over 3 weeks." I changed the ending twice. Bellard put down the paper. He said, "Mr. Breck, I'm denying the exclusion motion as applied to the child's statement. Section 25-403 is clear." Breck said, "Your Honor." Bellard said, "It's clear." He looked at Cora. He said, "Go ahead." She opened the bag. The zip made a sound, small and exact in the quiet room. She took out the folded paper. She unfolded it, 1 crease, then the second crease, and smoothed it on the table in front of her. And in that moment, Garrett Lund looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees, and thought about a thing he had been keeping at the back of his mind since Tuesday evening. Since the moment on Sutton Street when Bev said the words dependency review, because those words opened a door in him that he kept locked and latched and waited from the other side, and behind the door was a boy named Marcus, who had been the son of a man named Carl Duda, the younger brother of Phil Duda, his road captain, and Marcus had been 9 years old when the thing that should not have happened to him happened, and the department had had a case open, and the case had been managed, and the scheduled review had been continued twice due to procedural backlogs, and by the time the hearing came through, Marcus was no longer alive to address it. That was 12 years ago. Garrett had driven Phil Duda to the funeral and stood at the graveside in November wind and not said anything, because there was nothing to say that would have been enough, and he had driven home alone and sat in the corrugated steel building off Mesquite Road in the dark until someone found him there, and that was the only time in his adult life he had been found like that, sitting in the dark, with his hands open on his thighs, not doing anything, not going anywhere. He breathed out now. The room was quiet, and Cora began to read. Her voice was even, not flat, not performed, but even in the way a child's voice is even when they have practiced not the emotion but the words, and trusted the emotion to arrive when it was called for. She said, "My name is Cora Molina, and I am 8 years old, and I live at the house on Sutton Street with my mom. This is what I want the person in charge to know." She read without stopping. She read about sounds in the house at night, sounds she described without drama, the way a child describes the weather, because to her they were as ordinary and as unavoidable as weather. She read about the way her mother stood in certain rooms, the position of her shoulders, the way she moved near doorways. She read about a night in August when she had sat in her closet with the light off and counted motorcycles on the road outside her window by sound, because counting things made the dark manageable. She read about her father, and she read about him the way a child reads about someone they have not given up on and are afraid to have not given up on, with a grief in the words that was not performing grief but containing it. And then she read the ending she had changed twice, and the ending was this: "I wrote this because I needed someone big enough to hear it with me, and I found somebody. I think more than one somebody. So now I'm saying it, and I need you to write it down in the official way, and I need it to matter, because I kept it safe for 3 weeks, and I carried it a long way." She set the paper down. She smoothed it again with her palm, the same gesture, the same flat hand she had used when she first unfolded it. The room held. Harris, the DCS officer, had stopped writing at some point and was looking at her clipboard. Bellard was looking at the paper on the table. Selma was looking at her own hands. Garrett was looking at the door that had opened in him and deciding, for the first time in 12 years, not to close it back. Bellard said, after a silence of perhaps 15 seconds, which in that room was very long, "The statement is entered into the record in full." Then he said, and he dropped the procedural distance and used only her first name in a way that was not unprofessional but was unmistakably human, "Thank you, Cora." Arthur Molina's attorney began to say something, and Bellard said, without looking at him, "Not yet." The hearing ran for another 40 minutes. At its conclusion, Bellard modified the temporary order, citing the child's statement along with the DCS summary and the prior incident documentation that Selma had entered as exhibits, and he scheduled a full evidentiary hearing for 6 weeks out. It was not everything. It was not finished. But the door had moved. When Bev and Cora came out of the building into the thin October sunlight, 91 men were still there. Not all of them had stayed for the full hour, but 63 had, and the other 28 had come back, because Deke had sent a text at 9:45 that said 2 words, "Still going." Cora came down the ramp and stopped at the edge of the lot and looked at them, and Royce Farber, who was nearest to her, took off his helmet even though he hadn't been wearing it. It was a reflex, the gesture of removing a hat, and then the man next to him did the same thing with his bandana, and it went through the lot like something passed hand to hand, each man making some small gesture of acknowledgement, and 91 voices did not cheer and did not shout, but there was a sound, low and collective, a sound like an engine that has been running a long time and is exactly where it is supposed to be. 6 weeks later, the evidentiary hearing produced a supervised visitation order and a referral for a structured intervention program, and Bev Molina retained independent counsel through a non-profit referral that Selma Tran arranged at no cost. The temporary order that had been running in Arthur Molina's favor was vacated. By the following spring, the matter had moved through 2 more procedural stages, each one documented and attended, and at the final review hearing Derek Sheets and Selma Tran were both present, and Harris from DCS was present, and Garrett Lund was present, and Cora Molina was present, and the outcome was the one the law was supposed to produce when it was supplied with the full weight of what a child had to say. That summer, the Ash Creek Riders voted to establish an annual fund they called the Open Road Advocacy Fund, a modest reserve earmarked for legal aid and transportation assistance for families navigating dependency proceedings in the 3-county area around Ash Creek. The vote was 63 in favor, not a dissenting voice. They stitched a small orange and purple square into the club's common banner that hung in the corrugated steel building off Mesquite Road, colors that meant something to a handful of men who had seen a drawing on a refrigerator and said nothing about it, and did not need to. The bag was still at the Molina house on Sutton Street, on a shelf in Cora's room, empty now but kept. Garrett knew because she had told him when he stopped by in July, standing at the door the way he always stood when he stopped by, not coming in unless invited, which he always did. Eventually, after studying him for a moment with the same appraising look she had used on a highway turnout in October, deciding again whether he was something worth trusting. He was 53 years old and the last founding member of the Ash Creek Riders, and his hands still bore everything they had ever done, and his beard was still the color of a used railroad tie, and none of that was going to change. But in October, on a highway shoulder in the copper light of a desert evening, a girl had waited for someone big enough to knock, and he had stopped, and 91 had answered, and the door that a child had been holding shut inside him for 12 years had finally, at the sound of her voice reading a single page, opened all the way and let the air through. You think you know what a thing is by the sound of it coming down the road. You have always been wrong about that. The loudest engines belong to the gentlest hands, and the smallest voice, carried far enough and held carefully enough, is the one that shakes the room.